For as long as I can remember, traveling has been a big part of my life. I hear stories from my parents from my childhood of having been to California, New York, or various other places. It's always been a priority for my parents. They spent their honeymoon in Tahiti, visiting 3 different islands. They took a trip to Brazil together, leaving my brother and I at my cousin's house in Moses Lake. That was just fine by 8-year-old me, though, because I really liked my cousins. Anyways, I digress. My dad has been a big traveler his whole life. After graduating high school, he moved cross-country from New Jersey to California in pursuit of a job at the Jim Russell Racing School. Post-college, he did a 9-week backpacking trip across Europe, visiting places like England, France, Italy, Greece, Switzerland, Austria, Hungary, Czech Republic, Germany, Holland, Belgium, Finland, Norway, and Denmark. He's also been to Japan, and he's also been to China like 15 times. As you can see, traveling has been a big part of my parents' lives, and I've had the good fortune of having it passed on to me. When I was 3, I went to New York City. When I was 4, we took a road trip southwest through Oregon, Nevada, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, etc. When I was 12, we took a cruise to Jamaica, Haiti, and the Cayman Islands. When I was 13, I took a trip to China. When I was 14, I went to Mexico for the first time. I turned 15 on a trip to France, England, Spain, and Switzerland. And last year, I spent a month in Guatemala and Mexico with my old high school Explorations Academy. I've also been to Canada, Hawaii, and Florida a number of times. Just to summarize, travel is a very big part of my life. It shaped who I am in many ways, and I'm sure will continue to shape who I am in the future. Anyways, without further ado, here's my travel experience. The first big trip I took was a cruise to Jamaica, Haiti, and the Cayman Islands. It was pretty freaking awesome. This was due in part to the free soft-serve ice cream machines on the main deck. Anyways, our first stop was the Cayman Islands. Well, it was a very beautiful island. It was largely commercialized and is very touristy. We did get to go swimming with stingrays out on a sandbar, though, so that was awesome. Our next stop was Jamaica, and wow, was it quite something. After getting off the boat, we walked through a large area dedicated to attracting tourists. As we were walking through, a nice lady approached us and encouraged us to get a tour of the island by her sister. We accepted and met her sister, and she drove us around the island. Even though most of the island is inhabited, it's still very rustic. Scrap metal and wood buildings are a common sight along the roads, and taking a trip through a neighborhood, you'd find that many of the houses are unfinished and uninhabited. A really common thing for people to do is to buy a property and start building a house that they can't fully afford. So they build parts of it at a time whenever they have the means to do so. This means that you see a lot of single-story concrete structures with rebar sticking out of the top. It's really quite an interesting sight. As far as stereotypical Jamaican culture goes, in my experience, it's pretty accurate. However, it's hard to know whether or not the locals played along with these stereotypes intentionally. And at one point, I observed that the locals spoke to each other in another language called Pidgin English. So I did a little research and found on Wikipedia that their language is called Jamaican Patois. It's an English-based Creole language with West African influences spoken primarily in Jamaica. It's spoken by the majority of Jamaicans as a native language. Patois was developed in the 17th century when slaves from West and Central Africa were exposed to, learned, and nativized the vernacular and dialectical forms of English spoken by slaveholders. You learn something new every day. As disappointing as it is, my least favorite destination was Haiti, and not because of the poor conditions there, but really quite the opposite. So I expected to see around the interesting parts of the island. I wanted to experience the culture, the food, and the people, whatever that might entail. But instead I got the most touristy, isolated beach resort I've ever seen. It was entirely commercialized. There was no culture to be experienced, and it was really quite disappointing. Next up, China. Back in 2015, my dad was working for Microsoft, streamlining and improving the design of the production of their Surface Pro laptop tablet thingies. He spent a lot of time in China because of this, and one of the times he left to go to China, he took us with him. We seriously lucked out because one of China's biggest downfalls, smog, was barely present. This made the cities a bit nicer to be in. Our first destination was Hong Kong. Hong Kong was a fun introduction to China and city life. It's really interesting because when you look around, everything looks so new and urban, but when you look down an alley, there's dirt everywhere, and it looks rustic somehow. A general piece of information about Chinese cities is they are much dirtier than other cities. Cigarette butts and trash litter the streets. The view of the city at night is very pretty, though, as there are colorful lights all over the buildings and everything just lights up. Our next location was Yangshan, which was by far my favorite. This charming and rustic city sits surrounded by gumdrop mountains and beautiful green wetlands. The air here was probably some of the freshest I've ever breathed, despite having been to Switzerland and the fact that China doesn't have the best reputation for clean air. The food was incredible because everything was local and fresh. They have a booming tourism industry, frequently putting on large shows at night in the water, and bamboo raft trips are very popular here. It's very calming, believe me. The architecture here is very interesting. It's mostly concrete and it's very simple. It's not the imperial curved clay tile rooftops you think of when you think of Chinese architecture. Also, internet and computers aren't a big thing here. I guess that's to be expected when you live out in the country. Next up, Beijing. Beijing is pretty great. The temples are quite the spectacle and everyone wants to take selfies with you for some reason. Maybe it's because I'm ginger? Or maybe just because I'm white. Who knows? I don't speak Chinese, so I couldn't ask them. One downside to my experience here was my dad, brother, and I all got really sick. I woke up in the middle of the night to my brother throwing up on the floor because he couldn't find the toilet in the dark. The Great Wall of China is pretty neat though. It is absolutely massive and is very fun to walk around on. One downside is that over 1 million people died in the making of the wall and many of them were buried inside the wall. So it's a very spectacular dead man. Mans? It's a very spectacular dead man's relic. Next up is Shanghai. Definitely my favorite city out of all the modern ones I visited. We spent our time walking around the parks and seeing the sights. There were a lot of back roads that were home to many, many restaurants and shops. We even visited this weird restaurant whose entire theme is around toilets. You sit on toilets, and in many cases, you eat out of toilets. Great experience, would recommend. I'm not sure how normal seeing people with puppies is, but we saw a few, and they were incredible. We also had probably the best dumplings I've ever eaten there. You know what? They were definitely the best dumplings I've ever had. Not a doubt in my mind. It's kind of funny though. So we were walking around the city and we run across this restaurant. There are lots of people lined up outside waiting to get some dumplings handed to them by a man with charred hands making food in a large pan right in the window. We decided to try it, so we went inside the super cramped restaurant and ordered our food, and it was incredible. You bite into the dumpling and suck out all the soup, and then you eat it. They're called Shanghai soup dumplings. What was funny about all this, though, is there was a big frowny face on the wall. It was like this, but with a big frowny face. If you can guess, that means they failed their food safety inspection. But my goodness, I would still eat there every day if I could. In case you were wondering, yes, there are also people in Shanghai who want to take pictures with you. The next big trip I took was to Mexico in 2016. It was a great introduction to the country, and I really enjoyed my time meeting people and seeing how they lived their lives. We stayed at a rustic little hotel place in the middle of a village. I just got to talk for a moment about how awesome the place we stayed was. It was a walled-off jungle in many regards. Besides the A-frame structure where we ate meals, there was a beautifully blue pool surrounded by lush vegetation. Bunnies and dogs ran freely around the area, and there was a beautiful bird they kept in a cage. The only downside to this place was there is no air conditioning, and sleeping in hot, humid air is super uncomfortable. One of my favorite things about where we stayed was the children that liked to play soccer outside on the road. I decided to join them, and even though I knew virtually no Spanish and they didn't know English, the amount we could communicate was incredible. We communicated through hand signals and body language, and oftentimes I just knew what they wanted to communicate, as them I. When we left, I left them with one of the frisbees I had brought with me. We left early in the morning, however, and I couldn't give it to them directly, so I gave it to a nice Mexican woman who worked where we were staying and asked her to give it to the children. I wonder if they ever use it. I hope so. We also visited a number of Mayan temples. I saw a number of temples on this trip, but not nearly as many as I saw on my next trip to Mesoamerica. We did get to go swimming in these awesome waterhole things called cenotes. A cenote is a natural pit or sinkhole resulting from the collapse of limestone bedrock that exposes groundwater underneath. They can be anywhere from a few feet deep to over 1,000. They're generally only a few hundred feet deep at the max, however. The biggest trip I've ever taken with my family was a month-long trip to Europe. We visited France, Spain, England, and Switzerland. As crazy as it may seem, I complained a lot during this trip about how I wished I was at home. I guess it's because taking a trip to Europe was not how I envisioned myself spending my summer, and I refused to be open-minded. Looking back, however, I encountered nothing but fond memories, and I'm extremely grateful I was able to take this trip. If I were to go on a trip like this again, I would be sure to be much more open-minded. Our first stop was Paris. To be honest with you, I don't entirely get the hype around it. It seemed like a pretty average city, albeit big. One thing that I did enjoy here was the catacombs. It's incredible the number of people buried here. If I go back at some point when I'm an adult, good chance I'd find it a bit more interesting. The French countryside was a bit more my style. We stayed in a small little town surrounded by wine fields. The environment was very pretty and I enjoyed it very much. Our next destination was Spain. I love Spain. The way we had much of the trip planned out meant that I stayed with the host family in San Sebastian for 2 weeks. I met a lot of awesome kids my age who came from different areas. There were 2 French brothers who were total party boys, and there was a kid my age from Grand Cayman named Pierre. Fun fact, he got me into the game Counter-Strike Global Offensive, a game which I now have over 600 hours in, and I've made a lot of questionable choices surrounding the paid weapon skin aspect of the game. So I owe a large part of the last few years of my life to this relationship I formed all the way across the world in some random person's house. Interesting how things like that turn out. Pierre and I spent all of our time outside of school wandering the city, visiting candy shops, and seeing what San Sebastian has to offer. We had no adult supervision outside of school and home. In the evenings after dinner, we would wander around the city playing Pokemon Go. The city is absolutely beautiful, along with the environment and the people. The city is very well taken care of, and the beach that the city surrounds is covered in beautiful white sand. Also, people are incredibly fit here. Everyone looks so healthy and fit. I'm pretty sure that most of the overweight people I saw here were American tourists. No offense to anyone. They also religiously celebrate a practice called siesta, which is basically a 2-hour midday break. This allows time to take a nap or do whatever you want to do, really. We also visited Barcelona, which is also a very beautiful city, although I prefer San Sebastian more. There's not a whole lot to say about it, but one of my favorite parts of the city was the computer stores. Yes, out of all the places to be and all the sights to see, the computer stores caught my eye. Also, the Spanish countryside is breathtakingly beautiful. We spent a night in a charming little cobbled town and we hiked around the Ordesa National Park during the day. The sights were incredible. Next we went to Switzerland. Switzerland is an incredibly expensive place to travel, but it is also one of the most beautiful places to travel in. The mountain ranges are a sight to behold and the large fields are very well maintained, as is everything in this exquisite country. Also, I had the best gummy bears I've ever had here. They were insanely delicious. Another interesting thing that I ran into was this tall platform with a big inflated air cushion beneath it. We drove up to it and it was just a free jumping platform for anyone to enjoy. Of course, we had our fun with it. Our last destination on this trip was England. England is a really nice country. For the most part, the landscape is very beautiful and the architecture is very unique. You can tell just by looking at the houses that they're English. Also, everyone here sounds really fancy and drifting is a lot of fun. We also went to London and I really enjoyed my time here. One of the highlights of my time in London was going to a crazy department store called Harrods. If you know me, you can guess that my favorite part of the store was the electronics section. The Royal Guard is also a fun sight when you visit Buckingham Palace. The last big trip I went on was a month-long trip to Guatemala and Mexico with my old school Explorations Academy. I absolutely loved my time there. It was without a doubt the most adventurous and immersive trip I've ever taken. I also got to experience it with a group of friends. Crammed into a small bus heading to the airport, my head was full of ideas of what the trip would be like, and I was so curious what I might experience. 8 hours later, I get my first glimpse of the Guatemalan hills and the thriving capital of this awesome country. Driving through the city, we played the alphabet game, which is surprisingly much different here than it is in the US. Some letters that you find really easily in English are much harder to find in Spanish, and vice versa. Also, good luck finding K and J. They might as well not exist. Arriving at the small village of El Alto, we got off the bus, grabbed our bags, and started our walk to the Earth Lodge. Along the way, we saw street dogs, as well as small children and women in colorful clothing. We spent our day hanging out, and the next morning we caught a bus into the city. This wasn't any bus, though. This was a chicken bus. Chicken buses are old school buses with crazy paint jobs, decorations, and modifications. We spent most of our time in the city, visiting the cemetery, going to markets, and visiting the colonial church ruins. The markets are very cramped and people are selling everything from phones to hammers to clothes to spices. There's also a lot of very delicious food and fresh fruit to be found. This was our routine for a few days. Wake up, eat, bus to the city, visit the markets and see the sights. A few hours after lunch, head back to the Earth Lodge, hang out for the evening, and then go to bed. Some of the main staples of our diet was papaya, corn tortillas, beans, and avocado. Besides tasting good and being rather cheap, it also cleared up my skin a lot, which I actually didn't realize until about a month later when I came home. No mirrors is nice. Anyway, what made this part of the trip so impactful was instead of theoretically dipping my toes in the water, I jumped in. Moving on, we went back to the start, Guatemala City. Here we spent a day meeting awesome people. Our first stop was Farmaya, a company that produces medicines from plants used by Mayan people. In many cases, natural medicine is a better remedy than chemically Western medicine. Our next stop was a large house that was more appropriately called a lab. Inside the lab was a team of archaeologists led by Richard Hansen, the foremost expert on pre-classic Mayan archaeology. We also met Ronald Bishop, the curator of Mexican and Central American archaeology at the Smithsonian. We learned a bit about the process of analyzing and restoring artifacts. Then they bought us pizza. That evening we took a 10-hour bus ride to Flores. Then we caught another, luckily much shorter, bus ride to Tikal, a large ancient Mayan settlement. We spent a night camping here. Unfortunately, we couldn't camp on the temple, so we settled for the next best thing, a designated campsite. Tikal is a very beautiful place, by the way. Next morning, we drove back to Flores. We got settled into a cheap hotel, and not even an hour after arriving, there's parades marching through the city. There were more parades throughout the day, and later on, we found out that they were celebrating Black Christ. The next morning, we spent our day hanging out at the hotel and eating at the local restaurants and the food booths along the water. The next day, we headed out early in the morning to El Mirador, where we spent 5 days hiking 60 miles through the jungle of the Maya Biosphere Reserve. We stopped at lots of cool places along the way and saw many beautiful temples. The end destination was the ancient abandoned city of El Mirador, home to La Danta, one of the world's largest pyramids. Looking out across the endless sea of trees was one of my favorite parts of the trip. After returning to civilization, we drove a few hours to the border and made our way into Mexico. The next day we visited the city of Palenque, another magnificent Mayan city. We spent a number of hours here and then hopped on a 9-hour bus ride to San Cristobal. We arrived in the evening, got some tacos, and went to bed in anticipation for our week of volunteering at Escuela Primaria Adolfo Ramos Aguilar, an elementary school. We spent our time volunteering in classrooms, playing outside, and repainting the buildings. I remember kids loved giving us candy and food. They were also so intensely curious, and the classroom I was a part in loved trying to speak English with me, and the kids would always ask what words meant in English, especially their names. My week here was great, and I really enjoyed getting to meet the kids. Also, the tacos we ate at the restaurant near us were insanely delicious. Brain has a weird texture, though. Next, we went to a place I've been to on my last trip to Mexico, Chichen Itza. It was fun revisiting this incredible temple and teaching my friends a little bit about the history. A little piece of information about the Mayans is they were very scientific thinkers. The Great Ball Court was a large court where players would try to get a ball into a ring on the wall. Losers were sacrificed. Also, a neat thing about the way the stadium was built, the angle of the walls allowed for the king to hear what the guests on the other side of the stadium were saying without them being able to hear him. Our last destination was Tulum, where we relaxed at an outdoor hotel with mostly English speakers. We had full access to a large cenote where we went swimming sometimes. We cooked our own meals and spent time relaxing before our trip home. Our last night, we sat in a circle and talked about the highlights of the trip and expressed our appreciation for one another. It was a beautiful ending to a trip I'll never forget with people I love. Besides the memories, I also got to take home a little souvenir. All in all, if you ever have the opportunity to travel, say yes. You never know what adventure you might end up on. I'm extremely grateful for all my opportunities to travel, and I hope it remains a large part of my life in the future. This is my travel experience.